Let's face it, if you're a 90s kid, you either physically remember or seeing the Sony PlayStation, as it was both a $1 billion success. That is just a metaphor, by the way. Anyway, it was a success, and for Sony, it was just the beginning of a long line of consoles to form. But as we see in today's video, before the PlayStation even became the Sony PlayStation, Sony was looking into Nintendo to develop another console. The relationship between Sony and Nintendo started when Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi became interested in working with video games after seeing his daughter play games on Nintendo's Famicom video game system. He took on a contract at Sony for developing a hardware that would drive the audio subsystem of Nintendo's next console, the Super NES. Kutaragi secretly developed the chip known as the Sony SPC 700, as Sony was uninterested in the video game business. Most of his superiors did not approve of the project, but Kutaragi found support in Sony executive Norio Oga, I'm sorry if I butchered that name, and the project was allowed to continue. The success of the project spurred Nintendo to enter a partnership with Sony to develop both a CD-ROM add-on for the Super NES and a Sony-branded console that would play both SNES cartridges as well as titles released for the new Super Disc format. Development of the format started in 1988 when Nintendo signed a contract with Sony to produce a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES. The system was to be compatible with existing SNES titles as well as titles released for the Super Disc format, as stated above. Under their agreement, Sony would develop and retain control over the Super Disc format, with Nintendo thus effectively ceding with a large amount of control of software licensing to Sony. Further, Sony would also be the sole benefactor of licensing related to music and movies software that it had been aggressively pursuing as a secondary application. Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi, or Yamauchi, was already wary of Sony at this point, as Sony was the sole provider of the audio chip, the SSMP, used in the SNES, and required developers to pay for an expensive development tool from Sony. To counter the proposed agreement, Yamauchi sent Nintendo of America President Minoru Araki, I'm just calling him MA, and executive Howard Lincoln to Europe to negotiate a more favorable contract with Philips, Sony's industry rival. As described by David Sheff in his book Game Over, the Philips deal was meant to do things was meant to do two things at once: give Nintendo back its stranglehold on software and gracefully fuck Sony. At the June 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, Sony announced its SNES compatible cartridge/CD console, the PlayStation. The next day, Nintendo revealed its partnership with Philips at the show, a surprise to the entire audience, including Sony. While Nintendo and Sony attempted to sort out their differences, between 200 and 300 prototypes of the PlayStation were created, and software for the system was being developed. In 1992, a deal was reached allowing Sony to produce SNES-compatible hardware, with Nintendo retaining control and profit over the games. The two organizations never repaired the rift between them, and by the next year, Sony had dropped further development of the Super NES CD-ROM and instead refocused its efforts on developing its own console for the next generation of consoles, which became known as the Sony PlayStation. After the original contract with Sony failed, Nintendo continued its partnership with Philips. This contract provisioned Philips with the right to feature Nintendo's characters in a few games for its CDI multimedia device. And of course, some of the games sucked miserably, along with Legend of Zelda and some Mario games, along with probably either a Donkey Kong game, I can't remember. But never resulted in a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES. The Nintendo-themed CDI games were very poorly received, as I mentioned, and the CDI itself is considered a commercial failure. The main game in the development for the SNES platform, or SNES CD platform, launch was Square's Secret of Mana, whose planned content was cut down to the size suitable for cartridge and released on that medium instead. And I need to add, some of the games that were originally supposed to be for the SNES CD-ROM was, either cut down extremely of the graphics and from the CD format onto cartridge, or they were just unreleased at this point. So, further, Ken Kutaragi and Sony continued to develop their own console and released the PlayStation in 1994. The CD-based console successfully competed Nintendo's cartridge-based Nintendo 64 and other other CD-based console systems such as the Fujitsu FM, Towns Marty, the NECP. What the fuck? What did I even write down? I'm just gonna call them random consoles. The Panasonic 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, and the Sega Saturn. The broken partnership with Sony has often been cited as a mistake on Nintendo's part, effectively creating a formidable rival in the video game market. Nintendo would not release an optical disc-based console of its own until the release of the GameCube in 2001, and that has since been, actually, if you count the Wii as a it technically is, but it's more of a moving console where it lets you, the player, be the controller. Anyway, so yeah, that is it of the truth behind the Nintendo PlayStation, or the Sony PlayStation, if you like to call it. At this point, it is unclear if Nintendo is willing to, create another deal with Sony, and hell, maybe if we can see sometime in this new decade a Nintendo Sony console, that would be pretty good. But until then, the rift between Sony and Nintendo is still in effect, and it probably will be for the next coming years.